The sun rose slowly over the horizon, casting a golden hue across the city skyline. The streets were still quiet, save for the occasional car passing by and the soft chirping of birds awakening from their slumber. It was early, just the way he liked it. This was his time, away from the busy meetings, the phone calls, the endless demands of a life built on wealth and success. This was the time when he could just be himself. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the cool morning air as he looked down at his companion, the ever-energetic border collie at his side. The dog, with its black and white coat gleaming in the sunlight, wagged its tail eagerly, ready for their daily walk. Its eyes, bright and intelligent, seemed to mirror his anticipation for the walk. This was their routine, one that had remained unbroken for years. No matter the deals he was closing, the places he had to be, or the people waiting for him on the other side of the phone, he always found time for these morning walks with his dog. As they strolled down the cobblestone path through the park, the familiar sound of the dog's nails clicking against the pavement filled the air. The city was still asleep, and it felt as though the world belonged only to the two of them. The trees along the path swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves beginning to turn shades of orange and red as autumn slowly crept in. A few joggers passed by, giving him polite nods, but for the most part it was just him and the dog. He loved this time of day, the quiet, the peace. It allowed him to think, to reflect. Despite his fortune and the success he had achieved over the years, there was something about these walks that made him feel grounded, as though he could escape the chaos of his high-profile life for just a little while. His mind wandered, as it often did during these walks. He thought about the meetings he had later, the deals he was in the middle of, and the project that was taking up most of his time. But today, his thoughts were different, scattered. There was a restlessness inside him, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. The border collie trotted ahead, nose to the ground, sniffing at every patch of grass and bush along the way. Occasionally it would stop and look back at him, as if to make sure he was keeping up. He smiled. The dog had been his companion for years, ever since he had rescued it as a puppy from a shelter. They had been through so much together, and in many ways, the dog was the one constant in his life that hadn't changed, even when everything else had. Business deals had come and gone, relationships had faded, friends had drifted, but the dog remained, always loyal, always by his side. They reached the part of the park where the path curved around a small pond. Ducks floated lazily on the water, their reflections shimmering in the golden light. His dog paused for a moment, staring intently at them, its tail wagging in excitement before moving on. As they rounded the bend, he spotted someone up ahead, a figure sitting on a bench, alone. This wasn't unusual, of course. The park often had early risers, people who came for solitude just as he did. But something about this person caught his eye. She sat perfectly still, her gaze fixed straight ahead, hands resting in her lap. She didn't seem to notice him as he approached, or perhaps she didn't care. He couldn't make out her face from the distance, but there was something oddly familiar about her posture. The way she sat as if she was waiting for something or someone. His dog, usually indifferent to strangers, suddenly pulled at the leash, leading him closer to her. The closer they got, the more details he could make out. She was young, probably in her mid-20s, with long hair that cascaded down her shoulders. She wore a simple outfit, jeans and a sweater, nothing that stood out. Yet there was an unmistakable intensity in the air, something that made his steps falter just for a moment. His dog seemed unbothered, still tugging at the leash, eager to meet this stranger. For a moment he hesitated, wondering if he should just continue walking, but something about her made him stop. When he was only a few feet away, the woman finally looked up. Their eyes met, and in that instant, he felt a strange, almost unnerving sense of recognition. But it was impossible. He didn't know her. He was sure of it. And yet her eyes held something familiar, something that stirred a memory deep within him, though he couldn't quite place it. "Good morning," he said, breaking the silence, his voice coming out more uncertain than he intended. She smiled faintly, a polite, almost practiced smile. "Good morning," she replied softly. There was an awkward pause. He wasn't sure why he felt the need to speak to her, why he hadn't just kept walking like he normally would have. But the pull was there, something unspoken in the air between them. "Nice day for a walk," he added, gesturing to the park around them. She nodded but said nothing, her eyes flicking down to his dog, who had now settled at his feet, looking up at her expectantly. For a moment it seemed like she might get up and leave, but then she spoke again, her voice low and measured. "You come here often, don't you?" He blinked, surprised by the question. "Yes, most mornings," he answered slowly. "It's part of my routine. Do I know you?" The question seemed to hang in the air between them, and for a moment he wasn't sure if she would answer. Her eyes met his again, and this time there was something different in them, something deeper, almost as if she was weighing whether or not to tell him the truth. "No," she said finally, her voice steady, though there was a slight tremor beneath it. "Not yet." Her answer was cryptic, and it only served to increase the strange feeling in the pit of his stomach. He should have felt uneasy, but instead he felt drawn to her, as though there was something important he needed to hear, something he wasn't ready for, but something that had to be said. The dog, sensing the tension, nudged his leg gently, breaking the moment. He looked down at the collie and smiled, grateful for the brief distraction. When he looked up again, the woman was still staring at him, her expression calm but serious. "You have a lovely dog," she said softly, almost as if she were talking to herself. "Thank you," he replied. But his mind was elsewhere, still trying to piece together why this encounter felt so significant. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the dog. He nodded, and the woman crouched down, extending a hand toward the collie, who immediately trotted over, sniffing her hand before giving her a quick lick. The dog's approval seemed to put her at ease, and for a moment her face softened. "She's been with me for years," he said, watching as the woman stroked the dog's fur. "Rescued her when she was just a puppy." The woman smiled again, but there was a sadness behind it. She stood up slowly, brushing her hands on her jeans before looking him in the eyes once more. "Sometimes the things we save come back to save us," she said quietly. Her words hung in the air, and he found himself unable to respond. There was something about her, something just out of reach, that made him feel like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, about to fall into something he couldn't control. Something big was coming, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't know if he was ready for it. The air felt thicker now, heavy with the weight of unspoken words. They continued to stand in silence, the bustling world of the city slowly starting to awaken around them. But here, in this secluded part of the park, it felt like time had stopped. He glanced at the woman again, trying to push away the strange feeling gnawing at him. There was something undeniably familiar about her, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't place her face. Was she someone from his past, a fleeting memory that had somehow slipped away? His dog, still at her feet, seemed unusually calm, almost protective, as if sensing the importance of this encounter. The border collie sat obediently by the woman's side, as though it had known her for years. That more than anything unsettled him. His dog was friendly, yes, but she rarely took to strangers like this. Usually she was cautious, always observing before approaching, yet here she was, completely at ease. "So," he began, trying to keep his voice casual despite the knot forming in his chest, "you seem to know a lot about me." The woman looked up at him, her gaze unwavering. She didn't seem surprised by his question, almost as though she had been expecting it. She took a slow, measured breath before replying. "Not as much as I'd like to," she said softly, "but I know enough." Her response sent a chill down his spine. The ambiguity of it, the way her words hinted at something deeper, something hidden, only fueled the questions racing through his mind. He shifted his weight, his hands instinctively tightening around the leash. "You've been watching me, haven't you?" he asked, his tone sharper now. There was no hostility in his voice, but a growing unease that he couldn't shake. He had lived in the public eye for years, accustomed to being observed from afar, but this felt different. This was personal. The woman didn't flinch. Her expression remained calm, though there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Regret, maybe, or hesitation. "I've been looking for you," she admitted quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "For a long time." The words hung between them, thick with meaning. He felt a sudden tightness in his chest, the restlessness he had sensed earlier now blossoming into full-blown confusion. There were so many things she could be implying, but none of them made sense. He wasn't the type to have people looking for him, at least not in the way she seemed to mean. His business dealings were clean, his personal life quiet, or so he thought. Looking for me? He repeated, as if saying it aloud would help him understand. Why? Her eyes locked onto his, and for a moment it felt like she was peering straight into his soul, uncovering the parts of him that he had kept buried for years. The intensity of her gaze made him want to turn away, but he couldn't. He was trapped in this moment, bound by something invisible but undeniable. I needed answers, she said, her voice trembling now, as though the weight of what she was about to say was too much to bear. She glanced down at her hands, clasping them together nervously, and then back at him. There are things I needed to understand, things that only you can explain. His mind raced, searching for any possible explanation, but every thought led to a dead end. He had lived a complicated life, full of twists and turns, but nothing in his memory could explain this woman standing in front of him, this stranger who seemed to know more about him than she should. He felt an inexplicable urge to walk away, to leave this conversation before it went any further, but something in her eyes kept him rooted to the spot. "And what exactly do you think I can explain?" he asked, his voice rougher now, frustration seeping through. The woman's expression softened, and for the first time since they met, her confidence seemed to falter. She took a small step back, as if she needed the distance to brace herself for what was to come. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words seemed to catch in her throat. He could see the internal struggle playing out on her face, the way her brows furrowed and her lips pressed into a thin line, as though she was trying to decide how much to reveal. "You," she began, her voice cracking slightly before she steadied herself. "You don't remember, do you?" The question was simple enough, but it hit him like a punch to the gut. There was something almost accusatory in the way she asked it, as if she already knew the answer. His mind reeled. What was he supposed to remember? The more he tried to grasp at it, the more elusive it became. "Remember what?" he asked, his voice strained. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears now, and she quickly looked away, as if she couldn't bear to meet his gaze any longer. For a moment, she was silent, and he wondered if she was going to say anything at all. Then, with a deep breath, she finally spoke the words that would change everything. "You left," she said quietly, almost too quietly, "a long time ago, and you never came back." His heart stopped. Those words, so simple yet so heavy, echoed in his mind. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. He didn't understand. He couldn't understand. Left? When? Where? He hadn't left anyone, had he? His past was messy, yes, but nothing in his memory aligned with what she was saying. "You think you don't know me," she continued, her voice wavering, "but you do. Or at least, you did." His breath caught in his throat as the implications of her words started to sink in. The confusion that had clouded his mind was now giving way to something darker, something much harder to face. A memory, long buried, began to stir at the edges of his consciousness, but he pushed it away. It couldn't be that. It couldn't. "You have to understand," she said, her voice stronger now, as if she had found her resolve. "I've been searching for you for years. Ever since I found out the truth. I had to know. I had to meet you." He blinked, trying to process what she was saying. "Found out the truth? What truth?" "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice harsher than he intended. "Who are you?" For the first time, the woman smiled, but it wasn't a smile of happiness or relief. It was a sad, almost resigned smile, like someone who had known this moment was coming but had dreaded it nonetheless. "You really don't know, do you?" she asked softly, shaking her head in disbelief. "All these years, and you don't remember." He stared at her, his mind spinning, and then, slowly, like a puzzle piece finally clicking into place, he began to see it. The shape of her face, the way her eyes mirrored his own, the familiarity that had nagged at him from the moment he saw her. It was impossible. It had to be impossible. "I'm your daughter," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but it echoed in his ears like a gunshot. "And I'm not the only one." The world seemed to tilt beneath him, his knees buckling under the weight of her words. He staggered back, his hand gripping the leash for support, though he could barely feel it in his grasp. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat sending a wave of shock through his system. His daughter, she was his daughter, and not the only one. What did that mean? How could he have children he didn't know about? His mind raced back over the years, over the women, the relationships, the fleeting moments, trying to make sense of it all, but nothing fit. Nothing made sense. "You must be mistaken," he said, though the words felt hollow even as they left his lips. "I don't have a daughter. I would have known." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. There had been times years ago when his life was a whirlwind of decisions and distractions, when he wasn't paying attention to the consequences of his actions. He had made mistakes, many mistakes, but this? A daughter? "I wish I was mistaken," the woman said, her voice thick with emotion. "But I'm not. I've known for years, and now I'm standing here, in front of you, because you need to know too." He stared at her, his mind still refusing to accept it, but deep down, in a place he hadn't visited in years, he knew. The world around him seemed to blur as her words echoed in his mind. "I'm your daughter, and I'm not the only one." It felt like the ground beneath his feet had shifted, like he was falling into a dark chasm with no end in sight. His heart pounded violently in his chest, a rush of emotions rising so quickly that he didn't know which to focus on: shock, disbelief, fear, or even a creeping sense of guilt. The air that had felt crisp and fresh only moments ago now felt suffocating, too thick to breathe. His dog, sensing his sudden distress, pressed closer to his side, nudging his leg as if to comfort him. He looked down at the border collie, the only constant in this moment of chaos, and for a second, he clung to that small thread of normalcy. But it was fleeting. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion, trying to grasp at some thread of reality that made sense. He opened his mouth to say something, anything, but the words got stuck in his throat as though his body was refusing to allow him to acknowledge the bombshell she had just dropped on him. The woman, his daughter, stood there, her face a mixture of sadness, determination, and something else, something he couldn't quite place. She had delivered this life-altering revelation with such calmness, but now, standing there in the weighty silence that followed, her expression faltered. She seemed smaller, more vulnerable, as if she had just laid bare the most intimate truth of her life and wasn't sure what would happen next. Her hands, which had been steady moments ago, now trembled slightly, and she clasped them together in front of her, trying to maintain control. You're my daughter?" he finally managed to say, his voice hoarse, as though the very act of speaking took an immense effort. She nodded, her eyes brimming with tears that she was clearly fighting to hold back. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He took a step back, his mind reeling. How could this be true? How could he not have known? He had always prided himself on being in control of his life, on knowing everything there was to know about his world. But here he was, standing before a woman who claimed to be his flesh and blood, and he was utterly blindsided. His thoughts raced back to the past, to the years when his life had been a whirlwind of business trips, high-stakes meetings, and fleeting relationships. There had been women, of course, women he had cared about, but none of those relationships had lasted. They were distractions, temporary, always taking a back seat to his ambition. He had told himself it was for the best, that he wasn't the type to settle down. He had made his choices, lived his life on his terms. But had there been consequences he hadn't anticipated? "I don't understand," he said, his voice trembling with confusion and anger. "How is this possible? Why now? Why didn't I know about you before?" His daughter, swallowed hard, taking a deep breath before answering. "I didn't know about you either. Not for a long time. My mother, she never told me. She kept it a secret." He blinked, struggling to process this new layer of information. "Your mother," he repeated, his mind immediately cycling through the faces of women from his past, trying to figure out who she was talking about. His relationships had always been casual, never serious enough to result in something like this. Or at least, that's what he had always believed. "Who is your mother?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. The woman's face tightened with emotion. "Her name is Lisa," she said softly. "Lisa Coleman." Lisa Coleman. The name hit him like a punch to the gut. He hadn't thought about her in years, but now, as the name slipped from his daughter's lips, memories came flooding back. He and Lisa had been together briefly, a whirlwind romance that had burned bright and fast before fizzling out. They had met during one of his business trips, back when he was still young and reckless, still hungry for success but careless about the consequences. Lisa had been different from the others, smart, driven, independent. He had admired her spirit, but they had both known it wasn't going to last. Their lives were on different trajectories. When the relationship ended, they went their separate ways without much fanfare. He hadn't given it much thought since. But now, standing here in this park, it all came crashing back. Lisa, his daughter. Lisa, he whispered more to himself than to her. But she never told me. She never said anything. She didn't want to, his daughter said, her voice tinged with a mixture of bitterness and sadness. She thought it would be easier that way. She thought it was better for both of us, if you didn't know. He shook his head, struggling to comprehend the enormity of what she was saying. Easier? How could keeping something like this a secret be easier? He had a daughter. He had a child he never knew existed. And all these years, that part of his life had been hidden from him. Why now? He asked again, his voice rough. Why come to me now after all this time? His daughter's eyes darkened with emotion, and for the first time he saw the pain she had been carrying. Because I needed to know, she said, her voice trembling. I needed to know where I came from. I needed to know you. It wasn't easy growing up not knowing who my father was, and when I finally found out who you were, I had to come. I had to meet you. Her words hit him hard, the full weight of them sinking into his chest. He had spent his life building an empire, amassing wealth and success, believing that he was in control of everything. But here, in front of him, was a part of his life that he had been completely blind to. His daughter. She had grown up without him, and the pain in her voice told him that it hadn't been an easy journey for her. He felt a pang of guilt, a deep gnawing regret that he didn't know what to do with. And you said... He hesitated, still grappling with the enormity of her earlier words. You said you're not the only one? His daughter looked down, her hands still trembling slightly as she clasped them together. Yes, she whispered. You have more children, 2 others. He felt like the wind had been knocked out of him. His breath caught in his throat, and he had to steady himself against the nearby bench to keep from collapsing under the weight of this new revelation. More children? Not just 1, but 2 more? How had his life spiraled so far out of his control without him even knowing? His daughter looked up at him again, her eyes filled with sorrow and a desperate need for understanding. I only found out recently, she said. It took years to track down the truth, to piece everything together. You weren't the only one Lisa kept in the dark. There are others, and we're all connected, through you. He could barely breathe as the reality of the situation settled over him like a heavy fog. 3 children, 3 lives that he had been absent from, without even knowing it. He didn't know how to feel. Anger, guilt, sadness, confusion. It was all too much. How could this be happening? How could his past come back to haunt him in such an unexpected, overwhelming way? I don't know what to say, he admitted, his voice breaking under the strain of the emotions surging inside him. You don't have to say anything, his daughter said quietly, though there was a tremor in her voice. I just needed you to know. I needed you to know that we exist, that we've been out here all these years without you, and now it's up to you what happens next. She took a step back, giving him space to process everything, but he could see the pain etched into every line of her face. She had carried this burden for years, and now that it was out in the open, the weight of it seemed to hang between them like a tangible force. He didn't know what to do with it, how to handle the mess of emotions inside him. His mind raced with thoughts of the years he had missed, the moments he hadn't been there for, birthdays, holidays, graduations, all the milestones of a life he had been absent from. And now, with 2 more children out there somewhere, the guilt gnawed at him even more deeply. He had spent his life chasing success, and in the process, he had lost something far more important: connections, family, the very things he had taken for granted. His daughter, this woman standing in front of him, had grown up without him, and there was nothing he could do to change that. But the question now, the one that loomed over him like a shadow, was what he was going to do about it now. The silence between them stretched on for what felt like an eternity. His mind was still reeling, trying to process the tidal wave of information that had just crashed into his life. 3 children, 3 people he had never known existed, who had been living their lives without him, without any knowledge of who their father was. He had spent years building an empire, acquiring wealth and power, believing that his success had come at little personal cost. But now, in the span of a few moments, his entire reality had shifted. The life he thought he had under control was unraveling before his eyes, revealing gaps and shadows he never knew were there. He looked down at his daughter, and saw the weight of her words reflected in her expression. She was standing a few feet away now, giving him space, but her posture betrayed her uncertainty. Her arms were crossed and her shoulders were slightly hunched, as though she was bracing herself for whatever reaction he was going to have. He couldn't blame her for being cautious. After all, how does a person react to discovering that they have children they never knew existed? His voice faltered. He cleared his throat and tried again, but even then, the words felt hollow, inadequate. I don't know what to say. Her eyes, so much like his own, flickered with a mixture of understanding and disappointment. She had likely imagined this moment countless times, rehearsing it in her mind, wondering what his response would be. But now that it was happening, the reality of it was far more complicated than either of them could have prepared for. The weight of years of absence, of missed moments and unanswered questions, hung heavy between them. I didn't expect you to have all the answers, she said quietly, her voice steady but soft. I just needed you to know. I needed to stop wondering, to stop searching. I needed to meet you, even if it's just this one time. The pain in her voice was palpable, and it cut through him like a knife. This wasn't just about her uncovering the truth about who her father was. It was about the life she had lived without him. The absence of a father in her life had left a wound, one that might never fully heal, no matter how many answers she found. He had been a ghost to her, a shadow figure whose existence she had only pieced together through fragments and whispers. And now here they were, face to face, and all the years of wondering couldn't prepare either of them for the weight of this moment. He could see that she had grown up strong, independent, someone who had had to find her way without the support of a father. That realization hit him harder than anything else. He had missed it all. The first steps, the first words, the scraped knees, the sleepless nights. He had missed every single moment of her life up until now. And there were two more out there. Two more children who had also been denied the presence of a father. It was almost too much to bear. His hands trembled slightly as he tried to gather his thoughts, but everything felt tangled, chaotic. I didn't know, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, as though saying the words out loud would make them more believable. I swear I didn't know. I believe you, she said, surprising him with her immediate response. I don't think you did. My mother made sure of that. Lisa. Her name felt like a ghost from another life, haunting him with memories of a time when he was reckless and carefree, when his ambition blinded him to everything else. He had been so consumed with his career, with the pursuit of success, that he hadn't stopped to consider the consequences of his actions. He had assumed that relationships were temporary, that they would end without lasting repercussions. He had never imagined that something like this, someone like this, would come out of that time in his life. What about the others? He asked, his voice hollow. Where are they? His daughter hesitated, as if weighing how much to tell him. I've met them, she said finally, her voice cautious. We found each other a few years ago. One of them, a boy, lives in another state. The other, she's closer, but she's not ready to meet you. She's still figuring it out. We're all still figuring it out. He felt a lump form in his throat as the gravity of what she was saying settled over him. Not only did he have a daughter standing in front of him, but there were two others, living their lives with questions and confusion about who their father was. He had missed everything. He had missed them growing up, missed every birthday, every milestone, every struggle. And now, even with this knowledge, he didn't know if it was too late to make any difference. Do they want to meet me? He asked hesitantly, afraid of the answer. Her eyes softened, and for the first time he saw the vulnerability she had been hiding. I don't know, she admitted. They're as confused as I was. It's not easy finding out that the person you've been looking for your whole life is someone you've never even spoken to. They're scared. I'm scared. Her words hit him like a tidal wave. She was scared. Of course she was. How could she not be? She had spent years wondering who he was, and now, standing in front of him, she was seeing not a perfect image, but a flawed, fallible man, someone who hadn't been there when she needed him most. I didn't mean for this to happen, he said, his voice cracking. I didn't know, and I'm so sorry. For everything. She looked at him for a long moment, as if measuring the sincerity of his words, and then she nodded, just slightly. I know, she said. I didn't come here to blame you. I came here because I needed to know the truth. I've spent so many years not knowing. I just needed to see you, to know who you are." He wanted to say something that would fix the years of pain and confusion, something that would heal the wounds his absence had left. But there was nothing he could say that would erase the past. All he had now was the present, this moment, and the uncertain future that lay ahead. "I don't know what happens next," he said, feeling a wave of helplessness wash over him. "I don't know how to make this right." Her expression softened, and she took a small step toward him. "I don't think you can make it right," she said gently. "But maybe we can figure out where to go from here. It doesn't have to be perfect. We just have to start somewhere." He swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling deep within him. Start somewhere. Could they really? After everything? After all the years of silence and absence? Could he really step into this new reality? One where he wasn't just a man of business and success, but a father to 3 children he had never known? "I want to," he said, his voice low but firm. "I want to figure this out. I want to be in your life. I know I've missed so much and I can never make up for that. But if there's any chance, I want to try." For the first time since they had started talking, a flicker of hope crossed her face. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. She didn't smile, but her eyes softened, and she nodded slowly. "That's all I wanted," she said softly, "a chance to know you, to know where I come from." They stood there for a moment, the silence no longer heavy with tension, but filled with the possibility of something new. It wasn't going to be easy, that much he knew. The road ahead would be filled with difficult conversations, with awkward moments and painful truths. But as he looked at his daughter, at the woman she had become without him, he felt a glimmer of hope. A small, fragile thread that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way forward. He reached out hesitantly, unsure if it was the right thing to do, but when she didn't pull away, he gently rested a hand on her shoulder. It was the smallest gesture, but it felt monumental, like the first step toward rebuilding something that had been lost before it even began. His dog, sensing the shift in the air, wagged its tail and nudged his leg again, as if reminding him that he wasn't alone in this, that they weren't alone in this. "We'll figure it out," he said quietly, more to himself than to her, "one step at a time." She nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, and for the first time there was a sense of peace between them, a shared understanding that the road ahead would be difficult, but not impossible. As they stood together in the quiet of the park, the weight of the past finally began to lift, making room for something new, something uncertain, but full of possibility.